I had been looking forward to this hike for months. I planned it out carefully, checked the trail maps, packed my gear, and set aside a long weekend just for it. I wanted to test myself, to be alone in the woods for a few days, away from the noise of the city and the constant movement of everyday life. I thought I had everything covered. I had done plenty of hikes before, some tough, some easy, but this one felt like a real challenge. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous. It was just a long trail through rugged country. I thought the hardest part would be the steep climbs and the weight of my pack. I had no idea how quickly things could go wrong when I made just a few bad choices. I parked my car at the trailhead in the late morning. The sun was out, the air was cool, and the sky was clear. The air had that sharp mountain freshness that makes you feel alive. I shouldered my backpack and tightened the straps. I had food for 4 days, a small stove, a tent, a sleeping bag, a map, a compass, and a headlamp. I had water bottles and a filter so I could drink from streams. I thought I was prepared for anything. I locked my car, glanced at the empty lot, and started walking into the trees. The first part of the trail was smooth and easy. It followed a wide path under tall pines, with the sunlight breaking through in thin beams. My legs felt strong and my pack sat comfortably on my back. The sound of birds and the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt kept me company. I was in good spirits, enjoying the peace. For hours I walked steadily, drinking water every so often, stopping once to eat a snack. The trail climbed gradually, winding up through switchbacks. I could feel the altitude rising, but I didn't mind. I was focused and steady. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge with an open view of the valley below. It was breathtaking. Miles of forest stretched out beneath me, with mountain peaks in the distance, their tops capped with lingering snow. I stood there for a long time, breathing it in, feeling small against the sheer scale of it. Then I pushed on, knowing I still had a few more hours before I'd reach the campsite marked on the map. The campsite was a small clearing near a creek. I set down my pack, stretched my back, and went about setting up my tent. The sun was dipping low, and the light turned gold across the trees. I boiled water, ate a warm meal, and sat listening to the water trickling nearby. Everything felt right. When darkness came, I crawled into my tent, zipped up the door, and rested in my sleeping bag. I fell asleep fast, tired from the day's climb. That first night was peaceful. I woke once to the sound of an owl and then slept again until morning. The air was cold when I stepped out of the tent, and my breath clouded in front of me. I made coffee on the stove and watched the forest slowly brighten. I felt ready for the second day, which was supposed to be the hardest part. The trail would climb higher, cross rocky ridges, and then dip down into a deep basin. I checked my map, folded it back, and started off. The trail grew narrower, rougher, and steeper. My boots scraped against loose rocks. The trees thinned, giving way to stunted brush and exposed stone. My legs burned with the effort, but I kept a steady pace. By midday, I was high on the ridge, looking across at jagged peaks. The wind was strong there, and I had to keep my hat pulled down tight. I stopped to eat lunch, sitting on a flat rock, and felt proud of how far I had come. My body felt tired, but I still had energy. I thought about how good it would feel to reach the basin and rest. That was when I made my first mistake. The trail forked. One path was marked on my map, curving down toward the basin. The other was faint, less clear, but it seemed like it might cut directly across, saving time. I hesitated. The map didn't show the second path clearly, but it looked like it went in the right direction. I convinced myself it would be fine. I didn't want to lose time by looping farther out, so I took the shortcut. The path narrowed more and more as I went, until it was hardly a trail at all. I kept expecting it to meet up with the main trail again, but it didn't. Instead, it led me deeper into rough terrain. The rocks grew sharper, the ground steeper. I climbed down a section that was almost like a wall, steadying myself with my hands. When I reached the bottom, I realized I had left the trail behind completely. I was off course. I looked back, but the way up seemed impossible to climb again with my pack on. I decided to keep moving forward, certain I would intersect the real trail eventually. I pushed through brush, scrambled over rocks, and followed what looked like faint game paths. Hours passed. The sun shifted west, the light changing to afternoon. My confidence slowly eroded. I checked my map, but the terrain around me didn't seem to match. I couldn't find any clear landmark. I felt a pinch of fear but pushed it down. I told myself I just needed to keep heading in the same direction. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. My legs shook with fatigue. I hadn't found the main trail, and I had no idea where I really was anymore. I finally came across a small meadow near a stream and decided I had to stop for the night. I was far from where I had planned to be. I set up my tent, cooked a meal, and drank deeply from the stream after filtering the water. My body was sore, and my mind was uneasy. The woods felt heavier here, darker, quieter. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking, listening to the distant crack of branches and rustle of leaves. The third day was worse. I packed up and tried to orient myself using the map and compass. I picked a direction I thought would take me back toward the basin. I climbed steep hills, crossed thickets, and forded small creeks. Every step drained me. I slipped once on wet rocks and banged my knee hard, leaving it throbbing. I limped for hours after that. My food supply was shrinking. I had enough for maybe 2 more days if I rationed it. My water was fine, but the food weighed on my mind. I realized that if I didn't find the trail soon, I would be in serious trouble. That night, I didn't bother with a fire. I just crawled into my tent, hungry, cold, and scared. I thought about my car waiting at the trailhead, miles away. I thought about how I had told no one exactly where I was going, just that I was hiking for a few days. Nobody would know where to look for me if I didn't come back. That thought crushed me with fear. I lay awake for hours, listening to the night, every sound sharp in my ears. The 4th day, I woke weak and sore. My knee hurt worse, and my pack felt heavier than ever. I moved slowly, stopping often to rest. I thought I saw a ridge that looked familiar, so I aimed for it, climbing steadily. The climb drained me, but when I reached the top, all I saw was endless forest stretching in every direction. No sign of the trail, no sign of people, just trees and ridges and sky. My chest tightened. Panic pressed hard against me. I sat down, shaking, trying to breathe. I couldn't let myself lose control. I knew if I panicked, I'd make things worse. I forced myself to keep moving. I followed the ridge, then descended into another valley. My water filter clogged with silt when I tried to drink from a muddy stream, and I had to spend precious time cleaning it out. My stomach cramped with hunger. I chewed slowly on the last of my trail mix, trying to make it last. My lips were dry, cracked from the wind. My skin burned from the sun. That evening, I set up my tent in a hollow between trees. I had only one small meal left. My body felt weak, trembling when I lifted my pack. I knew I had to get out soon. I couldn't last much longer. I stared at the map in the fading light, but it made no sense anymore. I felt like I was carrying just a piece of paper, useless and cruel. My compass needle spun as if it mocked me. I curled in my bag that night, shivering, sleep broken by nightmares. The 5th day was my breaking point. I woke dizzy, head pounding. My knee was stiff, and I could barely put weight on it. I staggered as I walked, using a stick as a crutch. My mind felt foggy, my thoughts slow. I saw shapes in the trees, shadows that weren't real, just tricks of my exhausted brain. I pushed on, step after step, until I collapsed beside a fallen log. I lay there for a long time, not moving, listening to my heart thudding in my chest. Part of me wanted to close my eyes and let it end. But then I heard something new, a distant sound, faint but real. Not wind, not leaves, but something steady and rhythmic. I pushed myself up and strained to listen. It was the faint rumble of water, a river. My chest surged with hope. Rivers often lead to roads or towns, or at least to signs of people. I gathered what strength I had left and hobbled toward the sound. It took hours, but eventually I broke through the trees and saw it. A wide, rushing river cutting through the forest. The water foamed white over rocks. I stumbled down to the bank, fell to my knees, and drank greedily after filtering. My body shook with relief. I sat there for a long time, feeling alive again. had been hiking for years, but this trip was supposed to be different. I wanted to push myself further, to test what I could handle on my own without any help. The place I picked wasn't one of the famous trails where people pass you every few minutes. It was a stretch of land that barely had a name, marked only by a thin line on an old topographic map I had ordered online. It ran through hills, dense woods, and broken ridges. The land was quiet, and that was the reason I wanted to go there. I packed light but careful. A tent, a sleeping bag, food enough for 4 days, a water filter, matches, a flashlight, a spare battery pack, and a small first aid kit. I had my knife clipped to my pack strap and a whistle just in case. The morning I set out was calm and gray, and there was a little coolness in the air. The trail started as an old logging road, wide enough for a truck decades ago, but now narrowed with grass and brush growing through cracks of dirt. The first part felt easy. My boots crunched against pebbles, and birds moved through the branches above. The smell of pine was strong, and I felt good with the air in my lungs. My steps were steady, and I covered ground fast. The quiet was deeper than most hikes I'd done before. Usually, you hear far-off voices, or a dog barking miles away, or even airplanes overhead. Out here, there was nothing but wind, birds, and my boots. By midday, I was deep in. The road broke down into a thinner path that twisted between trees. Some parts were slick with moss, and I had to be careful with my footing. I had a map folded into my pocket, and I checked it often. It showed the route skirting a ridgeline, dipping into valleys, then climbing back up. It didn't look hard on paper, but on the ground it felt different. Every slope took more out of me than I expected. I ate jerky and nuts sitting on a rock, listening. I thought about how still the place felt. I liked it, but there was something pressing about that kind of silence. When you're far enough out, you realize that if something goes wrong, nobody will hear you shout. The whistle hanging on my pack strap was only good if someone was already nearby. Out here, it would vanish into the trees and die. The trail bent downhill, and I followed it into a hollow where the light dimmed under thick canopy. The ground stayed damp there, soft with black soil. My boots sank, and gnats swirled in the air. The sound of trickling water pulled me to a creek cutting through the hollow. It was narrow, clear, and cold when I crouched to fill my bottle and pump it through the filter. I thought about camping there, but it was early still. I decided to push further, climbing the next ridge. The slope was steep, and I leaned hard into each step, sweat soaking into my shirt. At the top, the ground flattened into a bare stretch of stone, broken in slabs like teeth. I stood catching my breath and looking out over rolling green hills that stretched for miles. There wasn't a road, building, or tower in sight, just endless ridges, each one folding behind the next. I felt proud then, standing alone with the whole stretch of country laid out before me. I thought about how few people might have stood in that exact spot. I thought about how strong it made me feel to carry everything I needed on my back and to be so far from anything man-made. That feeling stayed with me until I started down the far side. The trail grew harder to follow as it wound into thicker brush. Sometimes I wasn't sure if I was on the real trail or just following a deer track. I used the map and compass, forcing myself to stop every so often and check my direction. The sun dropped lower, and I knew I had to find a place to camp. Finally, I came to a small clearing tucked between trees. The ground was dry, and a fallen log made a good bench. I set my pack down and started building camp. My tent was small and simple, just big enough to crawl inside. I drove the stakes into the dirt, strung the rainfly, and rolled out my sleeping bag. Then I gathered dead branches and built a fire ring from stones. When the fire caught, the smoke lifted into the darkening trees, and the air filled with the warm smell of burning wood. I cooked a small meal and ate with the firelight flickering over the clearing. Night dropped fast. The fire made a circle of light, and beyond that was blackness. I stared into it, hearing the small cracks and pops from the woods. Most were just normal sounds, branches shifting, a squirrel rustling, but some made me sit still and listen harder. I reminded myself that animals move at night. Deer, raccoons, foxes. Nothing strange about that. Still, when you're out there alone, every sound cuts deeper. I banked the fire low and crawled into the tent, zipping it shut tight. I lay in the bag, listening to my own breathing. At some point, I drifted off. I woke sometime in the night. I didn't know what stirred me. The fire outside had burned low, and the air inside the tent felt cool. My heart was beating harder than normal, and I strained to listen. That was when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, but I knew the sound. Weight shifting on leaves, careful but steady. They weren't quick like a deer's jump or light like a fox. They were heavy enough to press into the dirt. I lay frozen, listening as they came closer, then stopped. The tent walls were thin. If something or someone stood just outside, I wouldn't know until the fabric moved. I reached slowly for the knife by my side, gripping the handle hard. My ears rang with how hard I was listening. I heard nothing after that, just silence. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, until sleep finally forced me down again. In the morning, I stepped out, looking for signs. The ground held prints, at least I thought it did. Not clear, but scuffed spots in the leaves, pressed into the damp soil near the edge of the clearing. I stared at them for a long time. They weren't shaped well enough to know for sure, but they weren't mine. They pointed toward the trees. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a bear moving through, maybe something else. But bears don't walk in circles and pause like that. I felt uneasy, but I packed up anyway. I didn't want to sit there and think about it. The day's hike was rougher. The trail was harder to follow, the slopes sharper. Clouds rolled in, covering the sun. By noon, it started to drizzle, and the rocks grew slick. I pushed harder, wanting to get farther before the rain grew heavy. The forest grew darker in the storm. The sound of rain filled everything, drumming on leaves, pattering on my jacket. I lost the trail twice, doubling back, scanning for markers. My legs burned from climbing, and mud pulled at my boots. When the rain finally broke, the ground steamed, and the air felt thick. I reached another ridge and looked for a camp spot. I was more tired than the night before, and my nerves still felt raw. Every so often I thought I heard something behind me, but when I stopped, there was only silence. I camped near a stand of rocks that broke the wind. This time I didn't make a fire. I ate cold food and went into the tent early, zipping it up. My muscles ached, and my head throbbed from staring too long at the map. I told myself I'd sleep deeper, but I didn't. The sound came again, not once, but through the night. The same slow steps circling in the dark. Sometimes they grew faint, moving away. Sometimes they drew closer. I gripped my knife until my hand hurt. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I didn't want to see. Morning showed more marks in the dirt, some pressed deeper than before. I knew then that it wasn't an animal. The weight was wrong, the stride too measured. Someone was following me. Panic sat heavy in my chest, but I forced myself to move. I couldn't stay there. I packed faster than before, barely eating. My hands shook as I folded the tent. Every sound in the trees made me snap my head up. The hike that day blurred into one long push. I stumbled more often, my boots slipping in mud. The trail nearly vanished in places, and I had to cut across brush, checking the compass again and again. My throat was dry, but I drank less, worried I'd run out. By late afternoon, I came to a slope of stone that cut down into another hollow. My legs felt weak, but I had no choice but to descend. Halfway down, I slipped and slid, skinning my arm on rock. I swore under my breath and bandaged it quick, shaking from more than pain. I knew I was running low on strength. That night, I didn't even set the tent. I huddled under a tarp strung between two trees, too tired to do more. I lay in my bag, staring out at the black woods. The sound came again, this time closer than ever. Steps pressing into wet ground, breaking twigs. I held the knife against my chest, every muscle tight. My ears picked out breathing slow, steady, human. I stayed awake until dawn, eyes burning, heart racing. When the first gray light came, I packed up and started moving before the woods were even bright. My only thought was to get out. I checked the map. If I pushed hard, I could loop the trail back toward the logging road by nightfall. My legs shook, but I didn't stop. I kept checking behind me, but the trees showed nothing. I had been hiking for years before I made the mistake of pushing myself too far that summer. I always thought I knew my limits. I told myself I was careful, that I had the experience to keep out of trouble. I had been through rain, heat, cold, mud, and everything in between. But the truth is, the wilderness has a way of humbling you when you least expect it. It started with what was supposed to be a simple solo hike. I had taken a few days off work and wanted to use the time for something quiet, away from people. I had been looking at a trail in the northern part of the state for weeks. It wasn't the most popular spot, which appealed to me. I liked the idea of silence, of being deep in the woods without the sound of cars or voices around. The trail was long, stretching over 20 miles, but I had no plans to finish it in one go. My idea was to hike halfway, camp for the night, and then turn back the next day. I set out on a bright morning with my pack heavy on my back. Inside I had my tent, sleeping bag, food, a water filter, extra clothes, and a small first aid kit. I felt prepared. The trail began gently, winding through tall trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was cool and smelled of pine. Birds moved through the branches above me, and now and then a squirrel darted across the dirt path. For the first few hours, I felt nothing but calm. The sound of my boots on the packed soil mixed with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The ground climbed slowly, not enough to strain me, but enough that I noticed my legs working harder than on flat ground. I drank water often and checked my map every so often, making sure I was on the right course. By noon, I stopped at a clearing to eat. I pulled out a sandwich I had made the night before and sat on a fallen log. The clearing opened to a wide view of the valley below. The sun reflected off a river that cut through the forest, and the air carried the faint sound of rushing water. I sat for a while, enjoying it. Nothing seemed wrong. After eating, I kept moving. The trail began to grow narrower, and the trees pressed closer together. Roots crossed the path, and I had to watch my steps more carefully. The climb grew steeper. My shoulders ached from the pack, and sweat dampened my shirt, but I told myself it was part of the hike. I wanted to reach a ridge I had marked on my map before evening. From there, I would camp and watch the sunset. But things don't always go the way you plan. It was late afternoon when I first noticed the sky shifting. The sun had slipped behind a thick layer of clouds, and the light dimmed. At first, I thought little of it. Clouds come and go, I told myself. But within an hour, the woods around me grew dark and heavy. The air cooled sharply, and the wind picked up. I stopped to check the sky through a gap in the branches. The clouds had piled into a thick wall of gray. A storm was rolling in, and I was still hours from the ridge. I hesitated. I could turn back, but I had already covered so much distance, and part of me wanted to keep going. I told myself I could reach the ridge before the worst of it came. That was my mistake. The rain began not long after. At first, it was only a few drops tapping the leaves overhead. Then the drops grew heavier until water was falling in sheets. The path turned slick beneath my boots. Mud clung to the soles and made each step a slow effort. The rain soaked my clothes in minutes, and though I had a poncho, the water ran down into my sleeves and collar. I pushed on, though the storm grew louder. Thunder cracked across the mountains, deep and rolling, and each time it came I felt it in my chest. Lightning lit the sky, bright enough to show the dark shapes of trees bending in the wind. I gripped my trekking pole tighter and leaned forward against the gusts. The trail became harder to follow. Water rushed down the slope, turning parts of the path into streams. My map was nearly useless in the storm. I tried to keep track of landmarks, boulders, large trees, a sharp bend in the trail, but everything blurred together in the rain. The woods seemed endless. By the time evening came, I was far from the ridge and nowhere near a safe campsite. The storm showed no sign of passing. My body was exhausted, and the weight of the pack dragged at my shoulders. I knew I had to stop soon. I searched for any flat spot where I could set up my tent, but the ground was either too steep or flooded. Finally, I found a small hollow beneath a stand of fir trees. The branches caught some of the rain, though water still dripped through in steady drops. I dropped my pack and forced myself to set up the tent. My fingers were stiff and clumsy from the cold, and it took far longer than it should have. When I finally crawled inside, the relief was overwhelming. I stripped off my wet clothes, pulled on dry ones, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The sound of the storm drummed on the thin fabric of the tent, constant and loud. I ate a small meal, but my stomach was tight with nerves. I kept thinking about the path I had taken. I wasn't sure how far off course I was. The storm had pulled me away from my plan, and I no longer knew exactly where I had stopped. I tried not to dwell on it. I told myself I could figure it out in the morning. That night felt endless. The rain never slowed. Wind shook the tent so hard I thought it might collapse. Branches cracked in the woods, and each sound made my heart jump. I barely slept. I kept drifting off only to jolt awake again, tense and alert. By morning, the storm had calmed but not passed. The rain had softened into a steady drizzle, and mist clung to the trees. I crawled out of the tent and looked around. The forest felt different, heavier, quieter. My boots sank into the wet ground. I packed quickly, eager to get moving. But when I started walking, I realized how bad things had become. The trail was gone. The water had washed it out during the night. Where the dirt path had been was now a narrow stream cutting down the slope. I searched for markers, for signs of where the trail picked up, but everything looked the same. The forest pressed in from all sides, wet and dark, with no clear direction. A knot tightened in my chest. I pulled out the map and compass, but they offered little comfort. Without clear points to orient myself, the compass was just a needle, and the map was just paper. I tried to guess, telling myself if I kept heading west, I'd eventually hit the main trail again. So I walked. Hours passed. My legs grew heavy. The drizzle soaked through my poncho, and my socks squelched with each step. My stomach growled, but I couldn't bring myself to stop for long. Every time I paused, the silence pressed down on me. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I had wanted when I set out. This was a thick, suffocating silence. Even the birds were gone. By midday, I knew I was lost. The forest didn't match the map at all. Hills rose where they shouldn't have, and streams cut across places where no streams were marked. My mind churned with worry. I thought about the storm, about how no one knew exactly where I was. I hadn't told anyone the full details of my plan. If something went wrong, no one would know where to look. I forced myself to stay calm. I kept moving, telling myself I would find a road, a river, some sign of people. But as the day dragged on, the woods grew darker, and a new fear set in, the fear of nightfall. I didn't want to spend another night in the rain. The thought of being alone again, trapped in that flimsy tent while the forest closed around me, made my stomach twist. I tried to push harder, moving faster through the brush, but it only wore me down more. When evening came, I had no choice. I set up camp again, this time on a small rise above a stream. My hands shook as I lit my stove. I forced myself to eat, though the food tasted like nothing. My throat was dry despite the water around me. That night was worse than the first. The forest was alive with sounds I couldn't place. Branches snapped, water dripped, and something moved in the brush. My imagination turned every noise into something dangerous. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. Sleep came in short bursts, each one broken by some sound or another. Morning brought no relief. My body ached, my eyes burned, and the rain still fell. I told myself I couldn't keep wandering blindly. I needed to make a real plan. I decided to follow the stream. Streams often lead to rivers, and rivers often lead to roads or towns. It was the best chance I had. I packed and began walking along the water. The ground was slick and uneven, and more than once I slipped on wet rocks. But I forced myself to keep going. My legs felt like lead, and my shoulders throbbed from the pack, but I pushed forward. Hours passed like that. The stream widened as I went, and hope flickered in me that I was on the right path. But the forest seemed endless. My body grew weaker, and a deep hunger gnawed at me. My food supply was running low, and I rationed what little I had left. On the third day, I felt myself breaking. My feet were covered in blisters. My clothes clung to me like a second skin, and my head ached from dehydration. I stumbled often, catching myself on trees. My thoughts grew cloudy. I never thought a simple hike would turn into one of the longest and scariest days of my life. Hiking had always been something I did to clear my head, to get away from the noise of regular life, to feel the quiet of nature pressing in on me instead of the endless buzz of traffic or voices or screens. I had been hiking for years, sometimes solo, sometimes with others, and while I knew that there were dangers out there, wildlife, weather, accidents, I always told myself that as long as I stayed smart, stuck to marked trails, and carried the right gear, I would be fine. That mindset gave me confidence, but it also gave me a bit of a blind spot, because when things actually did start to go wrong, it hit me much harder than I expected. The trail I picked that morning wasn't anything extreme. It wasn't a long backpacking route or anything that required ropes or technical gear. It was a section of trail in a large state forest that I had driven past several times before. It was about 8 miles out and back, and from the maps and descriptions I had read online, it seemed straightforward enough. Mostly rolling hills, a couple of creek crossings, some ravines cutting through the woods, but nothing that looked impossible or overly dangerous. The trail wasn't as popular as others nearby, which was actually part of why I wanted to do it. I liked being alone on trails, away from the chatter of families or the groups of people blasting music on portable speakers. The morning started normally. I woke up early, packed a small backpack with the usual things: water, trail snacks, a simple first aid kit, a flashlight, a small knife, an emergency blanket, and a map I had printed from the state forest website. I had my phone too, but I knew service was spotty out there, so I never relied on it. I wore trail shoes that had good grip, lightweight pants, and a breathable shirt. The weather was warm but not uncomfortable, a late summer day where the air already had a faint heaviness to it, as if reminding me that the season was close to tipping into fall. When I pulled into the small gravel lot at the trailhead, there was only one other car there, and it looked like it had been sitting for a while. I felt that usual little rush of happiness that comes when I realize I'll probably have the trail mostly to myself. I set off with a good pace, enjoying the crunch of gravel at first before it gave way to dirt and packed leaves. The forest was green and dense, with tall hardwoods stretching up and blocking much of the sun, though it still came through in broken shafts that lit up patches of moss or ferns on the ground. The first couple of miles passed without anything remarkable. I stopped occasionally to drink water, to look around at the way the terrain dipped and rose, to listen to the wind moving through the canopy above. There were birds, a few squirrels darting off when they saw me, and once I caught sight of a deer standing at the edge of a clearing, its head lifting and ears twitching before it bounded off deeper into the trees. I felt calm and steady the way I usually did out there. It was around mile 3 when the trail began to change. The ground dipped lower, and the trees seemed to grow thicker. I started hearing the faint trickle of water somewhere ahead, and sure enough, I came to a point where the trail crossed a shallow creek. The water was clear, moving slow enough that I could see the smooth stones on the bottom. I stepped across on a few larger rocks, careful with my footing. On the far side, the trail rose again, curving around and beginning to cut along the side of a steep slope. The map I had printed had shown that this area was full of small ravines, and I realized now that I was entering that part of the forest. The slope dropped sharply to my right, down maybe 50 or 60 feet to a narrower creek that wound through a rocky channel. The trail itself was only about 2 feet wide, and though it was solid dirt, I could see loose pebbles scattered across it. I slowed down here, paying more attention to each step. That's when the first real problem of the day happened. As I moved around a bend, my left foot slid out on some loose gravel. I instinctively threw my weight forward, arms out, but my momentum carried me down onto the trail hard. My knee slammed into the dirt, and the side of my hand scraped against a sharp rock. The fall wasn't catastrophic. I didn't tumble down the slope, but the jolt of it sent a wave of adrenaline through me. I sat there for a second, breathing fast, checking that I hadn't done worse damage. My knee throbbed, and when I rolled up my pant leg, I could already see a dark bruise forming. My hand was bleeding from a thin cut. It was manageable, though. I rinsed the scrape with a bit of water from my bottle, wrapped a bandage from my kit around it, and stood up slowly to test my knee. It hurt, but I could still put weight on it. I told myself to be more careful, to take it slower. Falls happen on trails, I reminded myself, and usually they're just wake-up calls more than disasters. I kept going. For the next half hour, the trail continued to wind through the ravine area, dipping and rising, sometimes cutting close to the edge where I could look down and see the creek glinting far below. Other times it dipped closer to the bottom, where the ground grew damper and thicker with undergrowth. The sun was higher now, and I noticed the air felt hotter down in the lower sections, the stillness of the ravine holding in the heat. Sweat was running down my back, soaking into the waistband of my pants. I didn't notice the wrong turn at first. The trail was marked with blazes painted on tree trunks, simple rectangles of white, and up until then, I had been seeing them regularly enough to reassure myself. But somewhere after another creek crossing, the markings grew less obvious. The trail itself was narrow and covered in leaves, and I realized later that there were faint side paths cutting off in different directions, likely made by deer or other animals. At the time, though, I just kept following what looked most like the main path. After maybe 20 minutes, I started to feel uneasy. I hadn't seen a blaze in a while. The trail beneath my feet was growing less defined, narrower, and more overgrown. I told myself it was fine, that maybe the Forest Service hadn't painted the markers here as often, but in the back of my head, I knew I had probably strayed. I stopped and pulled out the printed map. But standing there in the thick trees, I realized how little help it was. The map showed the general shape of the trail, the locations of creeks and ravines, but it wasn't detailed enough to match what I was seeing. The lines on paper didn't look anything like the endless green and brown maze around me. I considered turning back the way I came, but even that suddenly felt confusing. The path behind me didn't look as clear as I remembered, and I had that strange disorienting feeling, like when you spin around too many times and lose your sense of direction. I picked what I thought was the right way and started walking. That was when the real fear began to creep in. I'll continue building the story all the way to 7,000 plus words, with everything from getting lost deeper, exhaustion, survival attempts, real dangers like cliffs, nightfall, hunger, injury, and finally finding a way out with a very clear and detailed ending. I had been hiking for years, but I had never taken a trip as ambitious as the one I planned that summer. I wanted to test myself, to step away from the usual marked trails and popular routes where families, weekend adventurers, and tour groups moved in constant streams. I wanted to feel small in nature again, the way I did when I first started hiking. That was how I ended up looking at the less traveled paths in the northern mountains, the kind that only appeared on older maps, faint lines drawn decades ago when the area wasn't as regulated. I had been reading trip reports for weeks, most of them short, a few sentences about how overgrown certain areas had become or how some of the streams were dried up in summer. Hardly anyone had written much detail about the longer routes. That appealed to me. I figured fewer people meant more solitude, more quiet, more of the feeling I was chasing. The morning I set out, the sky was pale blue, stretched thin by the rising sun. My pack was heavy on my shoulders, loaded with food, water, my sleeping bag, a small tent, a knife, maps, and my compass. I had checked the forecast the night before. Clear skies for days, maybe some clouds drifting in later in the week. The air was crisp, almost cold, but my body warmed as I started climbing the gentle slope that marked the beginning of the route. The trail at first was easy, wider than I expected, with traces of footprints here and there. The soil was packed down by past hikers, though tufts of grass had pushed their way into the path in places. Birds moved through the trees above me, their chirps echoing in the silence. It was the kind of morning that made hiking feel simple, the kind of start where every step seems lighter than it should be. But as the hours passed, the trail narrowed. The footprints disappeared. I started brushing past branches and ducking under fallen limbs. My clothes snagged on twigs, and I had to use my knife a couple of times to cut through small sections that had grown completely across the trail. The climb grew steeper. My legs burned. Sweat rolled down my back, soaking into the waistband of my pants. I checked the map often, comparing the shape of the slope with the lines drawn across the paper. It matched, though faintly. I wasn't worried. This was what I had come for. By the time the sun was high, I had reached a ridge where the trees thinned out, and I could see across a wide stretch of mountains. Sharp peaks rose in the distance, some still capped with snow even in the middle of summer. Valleys dipped low between them, thick with trees that looked black from where I stood. The sight was beautiful but isolating. It made me realize how far from people I already was. There were no distant roads, no rooftops flashing in sunlight, no sound but the wind cutting across the ridge. I rested there, ate a small lunch of jerky and dried fruit, and drank from my water bottle. My pack pressed hard into my shoulders when I stood again, but I felt steady. The trail dipped on the other side of the ridge, winding down into the valley. That was where the map showed a stream, and I knew I needed to refill my bottles when I reached it. The descent was rougher than the climb. Loose rocks shifted under my boots, and the soil gave way in places where roots no longer held it firm. I slipped more than once, catching myself against trees. My heart hammered each time, afraid I would twist an ankle or worse. The thought of being stuck out here alone was always at the back of my mind, though I pushed it away quickly. It took longer than I expected to reach the bottom. The light shifted, slanting through the trees. Shadows stretched across the trail, and insects buzzed louder in the thick air. I finally heard the sound of water, thin at first, then clearer as I got closer. Relief spread through me. My throat had been dry for the last half hour. The stream wasn't much, just a narrow ribbon of water sliding between moss-covered rocks, but it was moving fast enough to be clear. I filtered 2 bottles and filled my spare bladder. The water was cold, sharper than what I carried from home. I sat beside it for a while, letting the noise of it fill my ears. When I stood again, I realized how quiet the forest around me had become. The birds were gone. Even the insects seemed distant. It was just the water and the sound of my boots pressing into the soil. I kept moving. The trail on the other side of the stream was harder to follow. Overgrowth had swallowed most of it, leaving me to scan the ground constantly for signs of where others had once walked. Sometimes I found faint impressions in the dirt, the suggestion of a path. Other times I just guessed, moving forward in the general direction the map showed. The hours dragged. My legs ached. My shoulders felt raw where the straps rubbed. The air grew cooler as the sun slid lower, and I knew I had to find a place to stop for the night. I looked for a flat patch of ground, something open enough for my tent but not too close to the valley floor where the cold would settle. I finally found a small rise, clear enough of rocks and branches. I set up quickly, the motions practiced from years of trips. As the sun disappeared, the forest grew dark in a way that city life never prepared you for. There were no lights in the distance, no glow from streets or houses, only black trees against a darker sky. I lay in my tent, listening to the faint creak of branches and the distant rustle of leaves. My body was tired enough that I drifted off quickly. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound that made my stomach knot. It was sharp, quick, like a branch snapping under weight. I held still, listening. The forest is full of noises at night. Animals moving, trees settling, even rocks shifting with temperature changes. But this had been close, just outside the thin fabric of my tent. I told myself it was nothing. A deer, maybe, the kind of sound I had heard dozens of times on other trips. Still, I lay awake for a long time, heart beating hard, ears straining for any other sound. Nothing came. Eventually, sleep pulled me back under. Morning light filtered weak through the trees when I opened my eyes again. I packed quickly, eager to get moving. My body was stiff, my knees sore from the climb the day before. Breakfast was fast, just an energy bar and a few gulps of water. The trail climbed again. The map showed I would rise to another ridge and then follow it for most of the day. I looked forward to the openness. Valleys pressed in tight, the trees thick and endless, but ridges offered space, air, the sense that I could see where I was going. Hours passed in a blur of climbing. My breaths came hard, and sweat dampened my shirt. I pushed through it, step by step, until finally the trees thinned again, and I stepped out onto the ridge. The view hit me harder this time. The valley behind me looked endless, a rolling carpet of green stretching to the horizon. Ahead, the ridge curved and twisted, rising and falling like the back of some massive buried creature. The sky above was a deep, perfect blue, but something about the ridge unsettled me. The trail was almost gone here, just faint scars in the soil. In some places, I lost it entirely and had to scan ahead for breaks in the trees that might suggest where it once ran. The wind was stronger, cutting across the open ground. It hissed in my ears and tugged at my clothes. By midday, I was tired in a way I hadn't expected. My legs trembled with each step, and my stomach growled constantly. I ate sparingly, rationing food even though I had packed more than enough. Something about the trail made me cautious, like I couldn't count on things going smoothly. The sun dropped lower again, and I started looking for a campsite. The ridge was narrow, steep drops on either side, which made it harder. I finally found a section wide enough to pitch the tent, though it was exposed. The wind rattled the fabric constantly, and I had to anchor it with rocks. That night, the noises returned. At first, just the wind. Then, faint steps. Not animal steps, too heavy, too uneven. They moved along the ridge, crunching the soil, pausing now and then like someone was standing still, listening. My chest tightened. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps moved past, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that. Every creak, every gust of wind made me jolt awake. When dawn finally came, I tore the tent down quickly, eager to move. My eyes felt gritty, my body weak from lack of rest, but I forced myself forward. The ridge narrowed again, and the trail vanished completely in places. I had to push through brush, climb over fallen logs, and pick my way around rocks. My legs were scratched raw from branches. My arms ached from pulling myself up slopes. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen any clear sign of the trail in hours. I pulled out the map, tried to line up the ridges and valleys around me, but nothing matched exactly. Panic prickled at the back of my neck. I had wandered off. I turned back, trying to retrace my steps, but the ground looked the same in every direction. Brush closed behind me. The faint scars of the trail had disappeared. My chest tightened, breath short and shallow. I forced myself to stop. Panic wastes energy. I had planned the hike for months, studying maps late at night and watching weather updates almost daily. I wanted to push myself a little, nothing too extreme, but far enough to feel I had tested my limits. The plan was simple. I would drive out to a remote trailhead, park my car, and follow a long loop trail that crossed through deep forest, steep ridges, and a gorge that had a small river running through it. I had done solo hikes before, but nothing that went this deep into an area with almost no service and very little human traffic. The morning I left, the sky was pale and clear. I filled my backpack with the usual gear: a map, compass, GPS, water bottles, filter pump, snacks, lightweight sleeping bag, extra clothes, first aid kit, headlamp, batteries, and a small knife. I had boots broken in from months of use, and I wore thick socks because blisters could ruin a trip faster than almost anything else. I told myself I would only be out there for a couple of days, but I packed enough food for 4 just in case something slowed me down. The drive to the trailhead was long and empty. The road narrowed into cracked pavement and then dirt. My cell signal dropped and never came back. By the time I reached the small gravel pull-off where the trail began, the forest was silent except for insects buzzing and the occasional crow calling from far above. My car looked out of place parked there, and I knew once I stepped away from it, I would be alone in a way that very few people allow themselves to be. I shouldered the pack and started down the trail. At first, the path was clear and well-worn. Sunlight came through the branches and dappled the dirt under my boots. The smell of pine was sharp and fresh. I walked steadily, getting used to the weight of the pack, and listened to the sound of my breathing and the crunch of gravel. After an hour, I felt warmed up and strong. I passed a wooden sign half buried in brush that marked the boundary of the gorge area. That was the point where the trail narrowed and dipped steeply downward. The gorge was beautiful at first sight. Rock walls rose up on either side, covered with moss and ferns. The river twisted far below, and its sound echoed against the stone. The air grew cooler as I descended, and light filtered indifferently, dimmer and green. I stopped to take a drink of water and studied the trail that curved deeper between the rocks. It struck me that I had not seen another hiker, not even at the trailhead, but I brushed the thought aside. This was what I wanted: quiet, peace, no distractions. The deeper I went, the rougher the path became. Roots clawed up through the dirt. Fallen trees forced me to climb over or crawl under. I checked my map at every fork to be sure I was keeping to the right direction. By afternoon, I reached a small clearing beside the river where I planned to rest. I dropped the pack, stretched my legs, and ate a granola bar. The sound of the water was steady and calming. I considered camping there for the night, but the day still had hours of light left, and I wanted to cover more ground. That decision would later weigh on me. I pressed forward, following the river upstream. The trail narrowed until it was little more than a deer path carved into the slope. In places, the dirt crumbled away, leaving me to edge along with the river far below. One wrong step would mean tumbling down rocks into freezing water. My heart pounded, but I moved slowly and carefully. At last, the path widened again, and I relaxed enough to drink more water and push on. Clouds had thickened by evening. The light dimmed quickly inside the gorge, and shadows stretched across the rocks. I decided to stop and make camp on a flat patch of ground near a bend in the river. I set up the small tent, gathered sticks for a fire, and boiled water for noodles. When darkness settled fully, I sat with the fire crackling low and wrote a few notes in my journal. The silence pressed in. No voices, no traffic, no lights. Just me, the fire, and the sound of rushing water. I crawled into the tent and tried to sleep, but I woke several times in the night to small noises outside. Branches snapping, something moving near the river. My body tensed each time, and I listened until my heartbeat slowed again. I told myself it was animals, deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. But the longer I lay there awake, the more I realized how vulnerable I was, zipped up in thin nylon, deep in a gorge where no one would hear me if something happened. At dawn, I packed quickly and started moving again. The trail grew steeper, climbing along the edge of the gorge where the river rushed harder below. My boots slipped on wet stone more than once, and I had to use both hands to steady myself. The pack dug into my shoulders, heavier than the day before. Sweat ran down my back, and I cursed my decision to bring so much extra food. By late morning, I noticed the sky had darkened again, heavier than before. I checked the map and realized I was still far from where the trail would loop back up out of the gorge. Storms could turn rivers into danger zones quickly, and I needed to make time. I walked faster, pushing hard, ignoring the burn in my legs. Then the trail split. One path climbed sharply to the left, rocky and overgrown. The other stayed lower, closer to the river. The map wasn't clear. I stood there, sweating, breathing hard, trying to decide. The lower path looked easier, and I told myself it probably rejoined the main trail farther ahead. I chose it without thinking too much. That was my mistake. The lower path narrowed until I could barely tell if it was even a trail anymore. I had to push through brush, duck under branches, and step carefully over slick stone. The sound of the river grew louder, and soon I found myself trapped between its rushing water and the sheer wall of the gorge. The path ended in a slide of rocks where the bank had collapsed. I stopped and stared, realizing there was no way forward. I turned to go back, but that was when the first drops of rain fell. Within minutes, the rain was heavy, pounding the leaves and turning the dirt to mud. The river swelled fast, the sound rising into a roar. I moved as quickly as I could back along the path, but the mud made every step dangerous. Twice I slipped and caught myself on roots. My boots filled with water. My clothes clung to me. Then I came to a section where the path had crumbled. Water rushed over it, and the ledge was too narrow to cross safely. My only option was to climb higher up the wall of the gorge. I dropped to my hands and knees and scrambled upward, pulling myself through slick plants and loose dirt. My arms shook with effort, and mud smeared across my skin. At last, I reached a small ledge above the water. I collapsed there, panting. The storm raged on. Lightning flashed, thunder cracked, and the gorge amplified every sound. The river below had turned into a torrent. I realized then how trapped I was. The main trail was above me somewhere, but I had lost it. My GPS was useless in the storm. The screen blurred with water. My map had turned soft and torn inside my pocket. I knew I had to keep moving upward or I would be stuck in the gorge, maybe for days if the water stayed high. I forced myself to climb. The wall was steep, and several times I slid back down, scraping my hands and knees. I tore my pants on a jagged rock. My muscles screamed, and the rain never stopped. But slowly, foot by foot, I pulled myself higher until I found another narrow deer path that angled upward. I followed it, trembling, soaked, and exhausted. Hours seemed to pass as I dragged myself forward. My legs shook with every step. I chewed on a protein bar with rain dripping down my face, barely tasting it. My water bottles were almost empty because I had spilled one during the climb, and I didn't dare try to refill them from the swollen, filthy river below. By evening, the storm finally broke. The rain eased, and pale light returned. I found a dry patch under a leaning rock and collapsed there. I was shaking, teeth chattering, body aching from the climb. I pulled out my sleeping bag, though it was damp, and curled up inside. I could not sleep, not really, but I drifted in and out, listening to the dripping of water and the faint sound of the river far below. The next morning, I forced myself to keep going. My body felt heavy and sore. Blisters had formed on my feet, and every step burned. But I knew I had to find the main trail. Without it, I would wander until my food ran out. I climbed higher, following animal tracks, hoping they would lead to safer ground. Hours passed. The forest thickened, and the slope leveled out slightly. I stopped to drink the last of my water and felt panic when the bottle was empty. Dehydration would come fast if I didn't find a stream. By afternoon, I stumbled across a trickle of water seeping from rocks. I dropped to my knees and filled a bottle, then pumped it through the filter and drank deeply. The cold water was the best thing I had ever tasted. It gave me strength to keep moving. That night, I made camp again, this time on higher ground. My body shook with exhaustion, but I forced myself to eat, chewing slowly even though I had no appetite. I studied what remained of my map. Most of it was ruined, but I thought I had planned that hike for weeks. It was supposed to be a challenge, but also a chance to clear my head. The route I chose was a long backcountry loop through rough terrain, a mix of steep ridges, dense forest, and narrow trails that clung to the side of cliffs. Most people avoided it because it was remote and tiring, but that was exactly what I wanted. I packed carefully, double-checked maps, carried more water than usual, and told myself I could handle it if I just stayed focused. The morning started well. The air was cool. The sky was pale blue with no sign of bad weather. I could hear birds echoing through the trees as I followed the trail uphill. The weight of my pack pressed into my shoulders, but I had trained enough that it didn't bother me. The dirt path twisted upward in long switchbacks. I watched the ground closely, the mixture of dust, small stones, and roots sticking up. Every so often I stopped, adjusted the straps of my pack, and took a deep breath, looking down at the valley below me. The higher I went, the thinner the trees became. Their trunks leaned at odd angles from years of wind pressing against them. The soil was loose in spots, and I noticed little slides of dirt slipping away when I stepped too close to the edge. On one turn, I paused to drink water and leaned against a flat boulder. From there, I could see the ridgeline I had to cross. It looked far sharper than I expected, the trail no more than a faint line carved into the rock. I kept going. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the heat. My shirt stuck to my back. Sweat dripped down my neck. I slowed my pace, saving my energy, drinking often, telling myself not to rush. Eventually, I reached the section I had seen earlier, the narrow trail across the side of the ridge. The ground fell away almost straight down to one side. The other side rose into a wall of rock. The path itself was only wide enough for one careful step after another. I hesitated before crossing. The drop wasn't just steep, it was sheer, hundreds of feet down into trees and broken stone. I tried not to look at it. I pressed one hand against the rock wall beside me and started inching along. Each step had to be precise. The soles of my boots scraped against the ground. Pebbles rolled away into the void when I shifted my weight. My chest tightened, but I told myself to stay calm. After what felt like forever, I made it across the first stretch. The trail widened slightly, enough that I could stand with both feet flat. I stopped there, breathing hard. That was when I noticed something I hadn't expected. Fresh claw marks in the dirt. They weren't from a person. They weren't neat like trekking poles. They were long grooves, curved like an animal had scrambled along the path in panic. I crouched to look closer. Some of the dirt was still loose, as if it had happened recently. I glanced up and down the trail but saw nothing. I kept moving, but more slowly. The path twisted along the ridge, sometimes dipping into small pockets of trees, then back out to exposed cliffs. I scanned the ground constantly now. In one shaded spot I found scat, bear scat, fresh. It was full of berries, damp and still smelling strong. My stomach tightened. I wasn't prepared for a close encounter. I had bear spray in my pack, but pulling it out fast on this kind of narrow ground would be tricky. The ridge stretched longer than it had looked from below. Hours seemed to pass as I inched along. At one point, clouds gathered, dimming the sun. The light turned gray. Wind pushed against me, making me sway as I balanced on the path. Dust stung my eyes. I pressed myself close to the rock and waited for a lull before moving again. Every sense felt sharpened, like I was hyper-aware of each sound. The scrape of pebbles, the rush of air through dry grass, and sometimes faint cracks in the brush somewhere behind me. I told myself it was nothing, just animals moving far below, but the feeling of being followed grew heavier. At last, the trail dipped into thicker forest again. The trees closed over me, dark and heavy. The ground here was damp, layered with pine needles. The air smelled of sap and rot. My legs shook with relief to be off the cliffs, but that relief didn't last. In the soil were more tracks, big ones, too big to be anything except a bear. They crossed the trail, fresh enough that the edges hadn't crumbled. I stopped cold. The tracks angled the same way I was headed. I tightened my straps and kept walking, quieter now, each step deliberate. My heart pounded. I tried to stay alert without panicking. The forest thickened, and the trail became uneven, roots twisting across it, rocks slick with moss. My boots slid more than once. I caught myself on branches, breathing hard. Somewhere ahead came a sound, not the usual shuffle of small animals. This was heavier, a branch snapping, weight shifting. I froze and waited. Silence returned, but the silence itself felt loaded. I moved again, slower, eyes darting to every gap between trees. The hours stretched. I lost track of time. The forest grew darker, though it wasn't evening yet. Clouds must have thickened overhead. I felt drained but forced myself to keep moving forward. Stopping didn't feel safe. At one point, the trail curved around a thicket. I stepped carefully, and when I rounded the bend, my stomach dropped. Ahead, blocking the trail, was torn earth. Something had dug at the ground, ripping up roots. The hole was fresh, damp soil scattered across the path. Beside it was a tree with bark scraped away, deep gouges running high up the trunk. Bears mark trees like that. The marks looked raw, splinters still hanging. I backed up a step. The forest seemed to press in tighter around me. Every sound sharpened again. The hum of insects, the faint rattle of branches above. I forced myself past the spot quickly, trying not to make noise. The rest of that day blurred into a steady grind of fear and exhaustion. I barely ate. My water was running low. The trail climbed again, weaving uphill, switchback after switchback. My thighs burned. My lungs heaved. I stumbled more than once, catching myself on rocks. But what kept me moving wasn't determination. It was the certainty that stopping wasn't an option. By late afternoon, the sky turned darker. Rain started, soft at first, then steady. The trail became slick. Mud sucked at my boots. My jacket stuck to my arms. I pulled my hood up, but water ran down my neck anyway. The forest smelled sharp and wet. I reached another ridge section, this one narrower than the first. My stomach knotted at the sight. The rain made everything worse. The dirt looked ready to slide. I hesitated but forced myself onward, one hand scraping the rock wall, the other gripping my trekking pole. My boots slipped twice, sending stones skittering into the drop. Wind howled. My pack felt like it was pulling me off balance. Halfway across, I heard it again. Movement behind me. Heavy, steady. I didn't dare turn around. If I looked, I might lose my balance. I just kept moving, faster, heart racing. At the far end, I collapsed onto my knees, gripping the ground. I finally glanced back. The trail was empty. Nothing but rain and shifting mist. But the sense of being watched hadn't gone. I pushed myself up and kept going. By the time evening came, I was wrecked. My legs felt hollow. My throat was dry. I found a small clearing just off the trail where the ground was flat enough to set up my tent. I worked quickly, hands shaking, fumbling with wet gear. The forest was dim, the rain easing but dripping from every branch. I made no fire, too wet, too much risk. I just crawled into my tent, shivering in damp clothes. Lying there, I listened. Every rustle outside made my chest tighten. I heard movement in the brush more than once. Not small scurrying, larger, deliberate. At one point, something snapped a branch nearby. I froze, gripping the bare spray canister. The sound lingered, then faded. I barely slept. Every hour I woke, listening, waiting. The rain kept falling, sometimes harder, sometimes soft. My body ached from tension. When dawn came, gray and weak through the trees, I packed fast and started walking again. The second day was worse. The trail climbed higher into colder ground. My legs felt slow, heavy. The forest thinned, replaced by rock and stunted trees. Wind screamed across the ridges. My hands were numb. I stumbled more often. My food was running low. But the worst part was the feeling that never left me. Every time I glanced back, I thought I saw movement vanish into the trees. Once, far up the trail, I spotted a dark shape cross and disappear into brush. I stopped, heart hammering. The silence afterward pressed hard on my ears. By afternoon, I was shaking with exhaustion. My boots were soaked. Blisters burned on my heels. I couldn't tell how much farther I had to go. My map showed the loop curving back toward the valley, but distance blurred in my head. All I could do was keep moving. At one point, I slipped on slick rock and nearly... I had been planning the hike for weeks. I wanted to challenge myself with a trail that was longer and tougher than the ones I usually did. Most of my hikes before had been day trips, easy loops, or out-and-back trails that took only a few hours. But this time, I wanted something that would push me a little further. I picked a trail in the mountains that stretched over 20 miles with a good amount of elevation gain. It was known to be remote and quiet, which was part of the reason I chose it. I wanted to be away from the noise of towns and roads. I packed carefully, double-checking everything the night before. I carried enough food for 2 days, plenty of water, a filter, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, and a small knife. I also had my phone, though I knew from reading about the trail that service was unlikely for most of the route. The morning of the hike was cool and bright. The sky was pale blue, the air fresh, and there was still dew on the grass when I parked my car near the trailhead. There weren't many other vehicles there, which didn't surprise me. This wasn't a popular place, at least not compared to the trails closer to the city. I locked the car, slung my pack on my shoulders, and started up the trail. At first it felt peaceful. The path wound through tall trees, with sunlight slipping through the branches and scattering across the dirt. The forest was quiet except for the faint sound of birds and the crunch of my boots. I liked that feeling, being alone out there. It gave me a sense of freedom. The first few hours went smoothly. I kept a steady pace, stopping only to drink water or check the map I had folded in my pocket. The trail climbed slowly at first, then steeper as it moved deeper into the mountains. The trees grew thicker, the air cooler. I noticed patches of moss on the rocks and damp soil underfoot. In some areas, the path narrowed so much that I had to push through brush and branches, scratching my arms as I went. I didn't mind. I liked the challenge. By midday, I had already covered about 8 miles. I stopped near a small stream to eat lunch. I sat on a rock, listening to the water as I chewed my sandwich. The forest around me was still. Felt good, but there was also something heavy about that silence. I realized how far away I was from anyone else. If something went wrong, help wouldn't be quick to reach me. The thought passed through my mind, but I pushed it away. I had prepared well, and I told myself there was nothing to worry about. After lunch, I kept moving. The trail became rougher, with loose stones and roots that forced me to watch every step. In some places, the ground was steep, and I had to grab branches to steady myself. I was sweating heavily now, my shirt sticking to my back. The forest seemed darker too, even though the sun was still high. The trees blocked out most of the light, and the path ahead twisted and vanished into shadows. I felt a little uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. Nothing was wrong exactly, but the deeper I went, the less comfortable I felt. A few hours later, the path opened up onto a ridge. From there, I could see across the valley below. The view was wide and quiet, no signs of roads or houses anywhere, just endless trees, rising hills, and far-off peaks. For a moment, I felt proud of myself for making it this far. But as I stood there, I noticed how empty everything was. It wasn't like the busy trails I was used to, where you'd see families or other hikers passing by. Here it was just me, completely alone. I tried to take comfort in that, but instead it gave me a strange chill. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, almost pressing against me. I moved on, wanting to get more miles behind me before evening. My plan had been to hike until late afternoon, then set up camp somewhere along the trail. I carried a small tent and sleeping bag, but as the hours went by, I realized I hadn't seen many good spots to stop. The ground was too sloped, or the brush was too thick. I kept going, hoping I'd come across a clearing. By the time the sun began to dip low, I was growing worried. Shadows stretched across the forest floor. The air grew cooler, damp, and still. I knew I needed to find a place soon. Hiking in the dark here would be dangerous. Finally, I found a small flat area off the trail, just big enough for my tent. I set it up quickly, hands moving fast as the light faded. By the time the tent was up and my sleeping bag spread inside, the forest had gone quiet in that strange way it does at dusk, when even the birds seem to pause. I made myself eat a little more food, though I wasn't hungry. Then I crawled into the tent, zipped it up, and lay in the dark listening to the faint rustle of the woods outside. First, I thought I'd fall asleep quickly. I was tired from the long day, but instead I found myself lying awake, staring at the thin fabric above me. Every small sound outside caught my attention. A branch cracking, leaves shifting, distant rustles that could have been animals. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Of course, there would be animals moving through the forest at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The thin walls of the tent made me feel exposed. I kept telling myself it was fine, that I was safe, but my body stayed tense, refusing to relax. Somewhere deep into the night, I finally drifted off. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke suddenly to a noise. It was faint but close. Not the usual rustle of leaves, but heavier, like footsteps on the ground. My heart pounded. I held still, barely breathing. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, moving past the tent. I wanted to unzip the door and look, but fear pinned me down. I just lay there, listening, until the sound faded into silence again. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a bear passing through. But the steps had seemed steady, too even, too controlled. The thought that it might have been a person drifted into my mind, and once it did, I couldn't push it away. The rest of the night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something outside. Sometimes a scrape, sometimes a snap of twigs. Each time I sat up, straining to listen, my body rigid with fear, but nothing more happened. Eventually dawn came, light seeping through the trees. I packed quickly, eager to move on. I told myself it was silly to be so afraid. I'd seen no sign of anyone else all day yesterday. Most likely it was just my imagination, twisting the sounds of the forest into something worse. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. As I set off, I kept glancing behind me, scanning the trail for movement. The second day was harder. My legs were sore and the path grew steeper. The forest closed in around me, darker and more tangled. Hours passed without me seeing a single person. At one point, I thought I saw something on the trail ahead, something pale that flickered between the trees. My stomach tightened, but when I hurried forward, there was nothing there, just branches and shadows. Still, my nerves were raw. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps from the night before. If it had been a person, what were they doing out there? Why hadn't they said anything? By late afternoon, clouds had rolled in. The air grew heavy, the light dim. It looked like rain was coming. I pushed harder, wanting to find a safe place before the weather broke. The trail twisted steeply upward again, and as I climbed, I noticed something that made me stop cold. In the dirt, half covered by leaves, were footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I could see the different tread pattern. They looked fresh, pressed deep into the damp soil. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen anyone else all this time. Who else would be this far out? I stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet woods. Nothing moved, but I felt suddenly exposed. I forced myself to keep walking, though my pace quickened. I didn't like the idea of someone else being out here, so close, yet unseen. The rain started not long after. First a light drizzle, then a steady fall that soaked through my clothes. The forest grew darker, heavy with the sound of water dripping from the leaves. The trail became slick, mud clinging to my boots. I slipped more than once, catching myself on branches. I knew I had to stop soon. Hiking in this weather was dangerous, especially with the ground so unstable. Finally, I spotted a small hollow near some rocks that looked somewhat sheltered. I set up my tent there, though the ground was damp and uneven. I was shivering by the time I crawled inside, rain hammering on the thin walls. That night was worse than the first. The rain masked other sounds, which made me even more uneasy. I kept imagining things moving outside, hidden by the constant noise of water. At one point I thought I heard something scrape against the rocks near my tent, but I couldn't be sure. My flashlight beam revealed only sheets of rain. My nerves stretched thin. I hardly slept at all. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground was wet and muddy. I packed up and started again, my body heavy with exhaustion. Every step felt harder than before. The trail twisted endlessly upward, my legs burning. But what unsettled me most were the footprints I kept seeing along the way. They appeared on patches of soft soil, sometimes ahead of me. I never thought hiking alone could push me to the edge of what I could survive. But this trip showed me just how fragile things can get when the smallest mistakes stack up. It was supposed to be simple, a long weekend away from noise, away from the city, just me and the trail. I had done solo hikes before, but never one this far out. That's where I went wrong. I underestimated how fast things could turn bad when there's nobody else around. I picked a remote trail system that I had read about online, deep in the mountains. The area wasn't popular, and that's what made it appealing. I wanted silence, the kind you only get when it feels like you're the only person left in the world. The guidebook said the trail loop was around 20 miles, with campsites along the way. The idea was to start early, hike in about 10 miles the first day, set up camp, then finish the loop on the second day. I had food, water, a tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, and a map I printed off the internet. I thought I was ready. The drive out took me through smaller and smaller towns until eventually there were no towns at all. Just thick forest and dirt roads with faded wooden signs nailed to trees. When I finally found the parking lot at the trailhead, there were only 2 other cars. Both looked like they had been there for days. That gave me a strange feeling, but I shook it off. The air was cold and sharp. The sun was high and the sky clear. Everything seemed fine. I set off with my pack, the straps tight against my shoulders, the weight pressing into my back. At first, the trail was wide and easy. Fallen leaves covered the ground in thick layers, and every step sent a crunch echoing through the quiet. I saw squirrels dart across the path, heard birds in the trees, and for a while I felt exactly the way I wanted to feel, free, far away from everything. But as the hours passed, the trail narrowed. The trees grew taller and denser, blocking more light. The air turned cooler. My legs ached, but I kept moving, glancing at my watch and map often. Around midday, I stopped at a clearing and ate some trail mix and jerky. The silence was heavy, like even the animals were holding their breath. I noticed then that the trail markers, the little colored blazes painted on trees, were spread farther apart. I pushed on, climbing gradual switchbacks that wound higher up the ridge. My breathing grew heavy, sweat soaking my shirt even in the cool air. I slowed, but I didn't want to fall behind schedule. The deeper I went, the more the trail seemed to fade. Sometimes it was just a faint line of pressed leaves. I followed what looked right, comparing with the map, but the map was basic and the terrain confusing. By late afternoon, I hadn't reached the campsite I was aiming for. My legs burned, and my shoulders screamed from the pack weight. The sky was dimming already, the sun sinking behind ridges. I finally found a flat space near a creek and decided to set up there instead. I pitched the tent with clumsy hands, ate a small dinner, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The cold seeped through the ground. Every sound outside, the snapping of branches, the trickle of water, kept me awake. I tried to calm my nerves, reminding myself it was only animals, only wind. When morning came, I felt stiff but determined. I packed up and checked the map again. The trail should have looped back toward the parking lot, but when I started walking, I realized something was wrong. The markers were gone. I walked for nearly half an hour without seeing one. I doubled back, scanning trees, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The forest twisted everything into the same shapes. My heart sank as the truth hit me. I had lost the trail. Panic crept up fast. My chest tightened, my thoughts raced. I forced myself to sit, take deep breaths, and think. I knew the creek was downhill, so I could follow it. Water always led somewhere. That's what I told myself. I moved along the bank, pushing through thorny brush, stumbling on wet rocks. Hours slipped by. The sun climbed and fell, shadows stretching longer. I kept thinking I'd see a road or a bridge, but nothing came, just endless trees and water. My food was dwindling. I rationed carefully, small bites of jerky, sips of water. My throat stayed dry no matter how much I drank. Every noise made me jump, imagining someone or something watching. My legs trembled with each step. I slipped often, cutting my palms on sharp stones. The woods felt alive, pressing in, hiding me from the world. By the second night, I had no choice but to camp again. I didn't bother with the tent this time, too tired to set it up. I just laid the sleeping bag on the cold ground. I barely slept, jerking awake at the sound of rustling nearby. My stomach growled painfully. The next morning, I pushed forward with sore feet and blisters. My socks were damp, rubbing my skin raw. I kept telling myself the creek had to lead somewhere, but the banks grew steeper, the terrain rougher. Several times I slipped into the water, soaking myself in icy cold that stole my breath. I kept going anyway, teeth chattering, clothes heavy. By afternoon, I felt dizzy, my vision blurred. I knew I was in trouble. I stumbled on, dragging my pack like dead weight. When I reached a fallen log, I collapsed onto it, head spinning. For the first time, I wondered if I would make it out. That thought froze me. I had never felt so small, so powerless. I forced myself to stand again. Each step became mechanical, just lift one foot, then the other. At last, near sunset, I saw something through the trees, a faint break in the forest. I pushed toward it with the last of my strength. The trees thinned, and suddenly I was standing on a dirt service road. I almost cried from relief. I dropped my pack and sank to my knees, my whole body shaking. The road wasn't marked, but it was wide, and I knew if I followed it long enough it had to lead somewhere. I forced myself to keep walking, though every step felt like knives in my feet. It took hours, stumbling in the dark, before I finally saw headlights far ahead. I waved frantically, stumbling into the road. The vehicle slowed, and though I couldn't hear over the pounding in my ears, I saw the brake lights flare. Someone had seen me. That was how I finally made it out. Exhausted, starving, bruised and cut all over, but alive. Looking back now, I know exactly what I did wrong. I went too far alone. I trusted a flimsy map. I didn't mark my trail. I didn't turn back when I should have. The fear I felt out there was like nothing else. The kind that strips you down to your most basic will to survive. When people ask me about that trip, I tell them the truth. The forest almost kept me. I'll never hike unprepared again. And I'll never forget how close I came to disappearing out there. Just another person who went for a walk and never returned. I had been planning a solo hiking trip for months, something that would push me out of my comfort zone but still keep me grounded in reality. I wasn't looking for any big adventures with cliffs or rock climbing, just a long walk deep into the woods on a trail that wasn't too popular. I liked being away from people when I hiked. Crowds made me restless, and the whole point of being out there was to escape the noise of daily life. I chose a trail that stretched far into the mountains in a region I hadn't been before. From the maps and the research I did online, it looked like a quiet place. Not many reviews were written about it, which I thought was a good sign. Most hikers stuck to the well-known trails nearby, but this one curved off into its own path, climbing steadily higher before cutting through dense forest and eventually reaching a narrow ridge. I figured I'd hike it for a couple of days, camp overnight, and then circle back the long way. The first morning of the trip felt normal. I packed my bag carefully, double-checked everything, and drove to the trailhead. The parking lot was almost empty, just 2 other cars, which put me at ease. I adjusted my pack, locked my car, and set off. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the smell of pine needles and damp earth. At first, the trail was wide and forgiving, almost too easy, winding through tall trees that blocked most of the sun. The ground was soft from old leaves, and every step made a low crunching sound. I could hear birds overhead, and every now and then a squirrel darted across the path. It felt peaceful, like the start of every hike I'd done before. But as I moved deeper in, the trail began to change. The ground turned uneven, with roots poking out like hidden traps. The trees grew closer together, and the air grew still. I noticed fewer sounds around me, fewer animals moving about. It was as if I had crossed some invisible line that marked where the forest changed from welcoming to cautious. I told myself not to overthink it. Trails always shifted like that, and forests weren't made to be comforting. They had their moods, their quiet stretches. I kept walking, adjusting the straps on my shoulders, feeling the sweat starting to collect at the back of my neck. By late afternoon, I had covered more miles than I expected. I took small breaks here and there, sipping water, eating quick snacks, but I didn't linger. I wanted to reach the ridge before it got dark so I could camp there and watch the sunset. That was my plan. When the trail started to narrow, I noticed it right away. What used to be a decent path wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side was now thinning into a strip, with thick brush pressing in on both sides. Branches scratched at my arms, and I had to duck beneath some low-hanging limbs. The incline grew sharper too, forcing my legs to work harder, and my breathing grew heavy. As the sun dipped lower, I realized I wasn't going to make it to the ridge before dark. I had underestimated how much slower I'd move on rougher ground. The shadows between the trees stretched longer, and the light dimmed until everything looked washed out. I started scanning for a spot to set up camp. The problem was that the ground was uneven everywhere I looked. Roots, rocks, and slopes made it hard to imagine pitching a tent. I pressed on, hoping I'd find a flat patch soon. Eventually, I came to a small clearing. It wasn't perfect, but it was flat enough and open enough for me to work with. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and began setting up my tent. By the time I had everything ready, the forest had gone quiet in a way that made me uneasy. No birds, no insects, just silence. I cooked a small meal on my camp stove, the flame hissing softly in the dark, and ate slowly while keeping my ears open. I wasn't new to the woods, and I knew animals moved around at night, but the lack of noise felt heavier than usual. It was the kind of silence that seemed to press against my skin, making every movement I made sound too loud. When I finally lay down inside the tent, I couldn't shake the unease. My body was tired, but my mind stayed alert. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me freeze and listen. Hours seemed to crawl by like that, me drifting in and out of shallow sleep, waking at the smallest sounds. Sometime in the night, I woke suddenly with the strange sensation that something was wrong. It wasn't a sound that woke me, at least not one I could clearly identify. It was more like a shift in the air, a presence, or maybe just my own nerves. I lay still, listening hard. Then I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves, steady and deliberate, moving somewhere nearby. It wasn't the quick dart of an animal. It was slower, heavier, like footsteps. My heart hammered. I held my breath, straining my ears. The steps grew louder, closer, and then stopped. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin fabric walls of the tent. I couldn't see anything, but I felt exposed, like whoever or whatever was out there could see me perfectly. Minutes dragged by. I waited, barely breathing, until finally I heard the steps again, this time moving away. They grew fainter, fading into the distance, until there was nothing but silence again. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, rigid and tense, until the first light of morning seeped through the fabric of the tent. When I stepped outside, the forest looked the same as it had before. Calm, quiet, harmless. But the feeling inside me hadn't left. I packed quickly, wanting to put distance between me and that spot. The rest of the day, I moved faster than usual, as if I could outwalk my fear. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but I saw no one. The trail kept climbing, and the forest grew thicker, darker. The higher I went, the narrower the trail became, until in some places it felt like I was barely squeezing through. Late in the afternoon, I reached a section of the trail that hugged the side of a steep slope. On my left was the mountain wall, rough and uneven. On my right was a drop, not straight down but sharp enough to make me cautious. The path itself was little more than a strip of dirt and loose rock, slanting slightly toward the edge. I slowed my steps, testing each foothold before shifting my weight. My pack felt heavier here, pulling me off balance, and the slope below seemed to reach up at me like it was waiting for me to slip. Halfway across, I heard something again. Not ahead, not behind, but above me. A faint scatter of pebbles, a shift of movement on the slope above. I froze, tilting my head upward. There was nothing, just jagged rocks and a few stubborn plants clinging to the slope. But I couldn't shake the thought that something was up there. I forced myself to keep moving, step by step, inch by inch, until finally the trail widened again and leveled out. I let out a shaky breath, not realizing until then how tightly I had been holding it in. But the feeling didn't leave. If anything, it grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being followed. That night, when I found another spot to camp, I barely ate. I set up my tent quickly, crawled inside, and sat listening. Again, the silence was heavy. Again, the night felt longer than it should. And again, I heard footsteps. This time, they came closer, circling, pausing, starting again. I sat upright, clutching my knife, though I knew it was useless against someone determined. The steps moved slowly around the tent, careful, deliberate, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard, but wasn't careful enough. I stayed awake all night, every muscle tense. By morning, I felt sick with exhaustion. I stumbled back onto the trail, my pack heavier than ever, my body weaker. Every sound in the forest now felt amplified. Every movement in the trees set my nerves on edge. Hours passed like that, me walking faster and faster, until I came to a fork in the trail I hadn't expected. According to my map, there wasn't supposed to be a split here. One path curved uphill, narrower and rougher. The other dipped down into thicker woods. Neither looked maintained. I stood there for a long time, staring, unsure which way to go. My gut told me to take the downhill path. It felt safer than climbing, but something about the way the forest seemed to swallow that trail made me hesitate. Behind me, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time I didn't wait. I took the uphill path, forcing my tired legs to climb, pushing through branches that clawed at my clothes. I didn't stop, not even when my chest ached and my throat burned. I climbed until I could no longer hear anything behind me. When I finally stopped, I found myself on a narrow ridge. From here, I could see far out over the forest, an endless sea of trees stretching in every direction. It should have been beautiful, but all I felt was exposed. I dropped my pack, drank what little water I had left, and tried to steady my breathing. That's when I saw it. Far below, near the fork I had just left, something moved. A figure, small from this distance but clear enough, standing still on the trail. Looking up, my stomach dropped. I grabbed my pack and turned away, moving quickly along the ridge, desperate to put more distance between us. For the next 2 days, I pushed myself hard. I had always enjoyed hiking alone. Most people I knew preferred group hikes or short walks on easy trails, but I liked the quiet, the space, and the feeling of being surrounded by nothing but trees, rocks, dirt, and sky. For me, hiking was less about exercise and more about clearing my head. The longer and rougher the trail, the more I felt I could leave behind the noise of regular life. That's what pushed me to take a long weekend trip one late summer. I wanted something remote, something that would make me feel far away from traffic, houses, and phones. After looking at some maps, I decided on a section of trail in the northern mountains. It wasn't the most famous route, which meant fewer people. The descriptions I found said it was difficult in places, with steep climbs, loose ground, and narrow ledges, but it also promised open views, quiet valleys, and a stretch that followed a cold, fast river. That sounded perfect to me. I packed the basics: a tent, sleeping bag, small stove, food for 3 days, extra water bottles, a knife, a flashlight, a headlamp, a lighter, and a first aid kit. I packed light, but not too light. I wanted to be ready for anything. My plan was to hike in about 12 miles the first day, camp near the river, push further up into the ridge on the second day, then loop back down on the third day. The morning I started, the weather was cool and clear. The sun came through the trees in long strips of gold, and the dirt on the trail was still dark with dew. My backpack felt heavy for the first mile, but I got used to it. The forest was thick, and the air smelled like pine and damp soil. For a while, I could hear birds calling back and forth, but after a few hours, the woods grew quieter. By mid-afternoon, I had covered most of the distance I wanted for the day. The trail dropped steeply, winding down through rocks and roots, until I finally reached the river. It was faster than I expected, a white and gray rush over big stones, the sound filling the valley. I found a flat area under some trees where I could set up my tent. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the river was only about 30 yards away. I boiled water, ate some dried food, and watched the river until the light faded. That first night was uneventful. I slept with the sound of the water steady in the background. A couple of times I woke up to small noises, branches snapping somewhere in the distance, but I told myself it was just deer moving around. I fell back asleep each time without much thought. The next morning I woke early, packed my things, and started the climb up toward the ridge. This part of the trail was rougher. The ground tilted up sharply, and I had to push hard, using my hands at times to steady myself. The forest thinned as I climbed, and patches of bare rock showed through. After about 3 hours, I reached a stretch where the trail narrowed to a ledge no more than 3 feet wide, with a steep drop on one side. I slowed down, planting each step carefully. The wind had picked up, and it carried the smell of dry stone. When I finally reached the ridge itself, the view opened wide. I could see miles of forest rolling out below, the river flashing silver between the trees. The horizon seemed endless, and the only sign of human life was the faint line of the trail I had just come from. I sat there for a long time, drinking water, letting the wind cool my face. From that point, the trail continued along the ridge, dipping and rising. I followed it until late afternoon, then began looking for a place to camp. The ridge was too rocky and exposed, but about a mile further the trail sloped down into a small hollow with scattered trees. I set up camp there, ate a simple meal, and stretched out inside the tent as the sky turned dark. That second night was when things began to change. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a dream that woke me. I just opened my eyes with the clear sense that something was off. At first, I thought it was the wind, since it was rattling the tent fabric. But then I realized I couldn't hear the steady sound of insects anymore. Usually the woods buzz and click through the night, but now it was almost silent. I lay still, listening. My heart was already beating harder than it should have been. Then I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps on dry ground. Slow, deliberate. A few steps, then a pause. Another few steps. They sounded close, maybe just beyond the glow of the moonlight outside. I stayed completely still. I didn't move or breathe loudly. The steps came closer, stopped again, and for several seconds there was nothing. I thought about reaching for my knife, which I had left beside my sleeping bag, but I was afraid even that small motion might make a sound. After what felt like minutes, the steps moved away. I heard them fade, then nothing but the wind again. I stayed awake for hours, straining to hear anything else. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me down, and I fell into a light, restless sleep. In the morning, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it could have been an animal. The steps had sounded like a person's, but maybe it was a deer or a bear passing nearby. I packed up my things quickly and got back on the trail. Still, I couldn't get rid of the unease. I kept looking behind me, half expecting to see someone following. That day, the trail took me deeper into rough country. The ground was uneven, the rocks sharp, and my legs grew heavy. The sun was strong, but the wind on the ridge made it feel cool. I covered fewer miles than I planned, partly because I kept stopping to look behind me. Each time I saw only empty trail and endless trees. By late afternoon, I found a spot to camp near a cluster of boulders. I built a small fire, even though I hadn't planned on it. I told myself it was just for warmth, but deep down I wanted the light. I ate, kept the fire going, and tried to settle my nerves. That night, the sounds returned. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It started the same way, with the crunch of something moving nearby. Then I heard what sounded like fabric brushing against branches. At one point, there was a faint clink, like metal striking against rock. I sat upright inside my tent, holding my knife, my heart pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. The noises circled slowly, never coming directly toward the tent, but always close. I wanted to shout, to scare off whatever it was, but the fear locked me in place. I waited, gripping the knife so tightly my hand ached. After what felt like hours, the sounds drifted away again, leaving only silence. When dawn came, I made a decision. I wasn't going to continue further along the loop. I needed to get out. I packed quickly and started back the way I came. My plan was to push hard, cover as much ground as possible, and try to reach the river camp again by nightfall. The hike back was brutal. My legs were sore, my pack felt twice as heavy, and I barely stopped to rest. I kept imagining footsteps behind me, though I never actually saw anyone. Each time the trail bent, I glanced back, certain that something would appear around the corner. By late afternoon, I reached the river valley again. Relief washed over me when I heard the roar of the water. I set up camp in the same spot as before, but this time I built a larger fire. I fed it constantly, stacking wood high so the flames would last. That night was the worst. The sounds came again, louder this time. I heard clear footsteps moving closer, then stopping. A rock shifted, rolled down a slope. I gripped my knife and sat by the fire, forcing myself not to look away from the dark. At one point, I thought I saw a shape move between the trees, but the firelight and shadows played tricks, and I couldn't be sure. The noises didn't stop. They circled again and again, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, but never gone. My chest tightened, and I felt the sweat on my back even though the night was cold. I stayed awake the whole night, never once closing my eyes. When the sky finally lightened, I packed my things faster than I ever had. My only thought was to get out. I followed the trail down the valley, moving as quickly as I could, my legs shaking from exhaustion but my fear keeping me going. The last miles felt endless. Every sound in the forest made me flinch. Branches cracked, leaves shifted, birds flew up suddenly, and each time I felt sure something, or someone, was just behind me. At last, the trail opened near the road where I had parked my car. The sight of it almost made me collapse. I dropped my pack into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors with shaking hands. Only when I was several miles down the road did I finally feel like I could breathe again. The trees thinned, the sky opened, and I left the mountains behind. I never found out what followed me those nights. Maybe it was a person, maybe more than one. Maybe it was someone living out there watching the trail. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, fear turning normal forest sounds into something more. But I know what I heard. I know how the footsteps paused, how they circled, how they never came too close but never left either. Since that trip, I haven't hiked alone again. The memory of those nights stays with me. The silence of the insects gone, the crunch of dry ground. I have always loved hiking, being out in the woods, away from the noise of cars, phones, and the busy world, always made me feel alive. I liked the feeling of carrying only what I needed on my back, moving step by step into places most people would never see. Over the years, I had done plenty of trails, some short and easy, others long and exhausting. I had learned how to read maps, how to carry enough food and water, and how to deal with sore muscles. But nothing prepared me for the trip that nearly broke me. It started as an idea to hike a remote trail I had read about in an old guidebook. It wasn't one of the popular ones where crowds gather. This was more hidden, tucked into a stretch of wilderness that didn't get much attention. The guidebook described it as beautiful but demanding, with long stretches of steep climbs, rocky paths, and very little in terms of marked campsites. That was what drew me in. I wanted something quiet, away from the world, where I could push myself and feel like I had really done something hard. I spent a couple of weeks preparing. I bought new trail shoes, packed dried food, checked my gear, and even practiced carrying the heavy backpack around my neighborhood. I didn't tell many people about the trip, just that I was going hiking for a few days. I didn't want anyone worrying about me, and honestly, I liked the idea of disappearing for a while. The day I left, the weather was perfect. The sun was out, the air cool but not cold, and the sky had that clear blue that made the trees and hills look sharper. I parked my car at a small gravel lot near the start of the trail. There were no other cars, which didn't surprise me. This wasn't the kind of hike people rush to do. I adjusted my pack, tightened the straps, and started walking. The trail began easy enough, winding through tall pines and open spaces where the ground was soft with needles. The smell of the trees was clean and sharp. Birds moved overhead, and now and then a squirrel darted across the path. For the first hour, I felt good. My legs were strong, my breathing steady, and I enjoyed the silence. After a while, the trail grew steeper. Rocks jutted out of the dirt, and I had to watch every step to keep from tripping. My pack dug into my shoulders, and I shifted it several times to ease the weight. Sweat built up under my shirt, running down my back. I drank from my bottle and kept moving. By afternoon, I had covered a fair distance. The guidebook had mentioned a small clearing where people sometimes camped, and I reached it just as the sun was lowering. It was nothing fancy, just a flat space with some fallen logs around the edges. But it was enough. I set my pack down, stretched my sore legs, and pulled out my small tent. The ground was hard in places, but I managed to get the stakes in. Dinner was simple, just a pouch of dried rice and meat, cooked with boiled water from my small stove. I ate slowly, listening to the forest grow quieter as the day ended. The sounds of birds faded, replaced by the steady buzz of insects and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I sat for a while, watching the sky turn darker. Then I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep. That first night wasn't too bad, though I woke several times to strange noises. At one point, I heard something heavy moving nearby, maybe a deer or something larger. My heart pounded, but nothing came close enough to worry me. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next day, I woke early, packed up, and kept moving. The trail was rougher now, climbing higher into the hills. The air grew cooler, and the trees thinned in places, giving me glimpses of ridges and valleys stretching far into the distance. It was beautiful, but it was also lonely. I hadn't seen a single person since I started. Not one hiker, not even a sign of anyone passing through recently. The trail felt abandoned. As the hours passed, I started noticing how hard the hike really was. The path was overgrown in sections, branches slapping against my arms and legs. Fallen trees blocked the way, forcing me to climb over them or crawl under. In some places, the ground was muddy, my shoes sinking in deep. I slipped more than once, catching myself just before falling. Each time, my heart jumped. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. My legs ached, my shoulders burned, and I knew I needed to find another place to camp. The guidebook hadn't listed many options, and I wasn't sure how far the next clearing would be. I pushed on, hoping for a flat patch of ground. Finally, just as the light was fading, I came to a narrow space between rocks where the ground leveled out. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. I dropped my pack with relief, set up the tent, and ate another simple meal. My hands shook as I held the food, more from exhaustion than cold. That night was worse. The forest felt different, heavier, almost like it was closing in. The noises were louder, sharper. I heard something moving again, closer this time, circling the edge of my camp. I held my breath, clutching my small knife, waiting. After a long time, the sound faded, but I barely slept. Every crack of a twig made me jump. The third day was when things started to go wrong. I woke up groggy, my body stiff, my mind cloudy from lack of sleep. I forced myself to pack up and keep going. The trail grew narrower, climbing higher along the side of a steep hill. Loose rocks slid under my boots, and several times I nearly lost my balance. One slip and I would have tumbled a long way down. As I moved forward, I realized I had made a mistake. I had underestimated the difficulty. My water was running low, and though I had purification tablets, I hadn't passed a single stream since yesterday. The sun was hotter now, burning down on me as I climbed. My throat felt dry, my lips cracked. Hours passed and still no water. My head started to ache, and my legs felt heavier with each step. I checked the map, but it was hard to tell exactly where I was. The trail markings were faint, some almost gone. I kept pushing, thinking the next bend would bring relief. But it didn't. By late afternoon, I was stumbling. My vision blurred at the edges, and my chest felt tight. When I finally reached a trickle of water running down some rocks, I dropped to my knees and filled my bottle. I used the tablets and waited as long as I could before drinking. The water was cold, metallic, but it gave me life. I found another rough spot to camp that night, but I didn't eat much. My stomach churned, and I just lay in the tent, listening again to the sounds outside. Something was definitely moving around me, and it wasn't small. The snapping of branches, the thump of weight on the ground, it kept circling. I held my knife again, my hands sweating, my whole body tense. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow outside, tall and solid, just at the edge of the thin tent wall. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I stayed still, barely breathing. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Eventually, it moved away. The next morning, I knew I couldn't keep going the way I had planned. I needed to turn back. My supplies were running low, my body was wearing down, and I didn't trust the trail ahead. The problem was, I wasn't sure exactly how far I had come or if I could even retrace my steps easily. I started back, moving as quickly as my tired legs allowed. But the forest felt different now. The trail that had seemed faint before looked even harder to follow. Branches hung low, blocking the way. Rocks looked unfamiliar. At times, I wasn't sure if I was even on the right path. Panic built in my chest. The thought of being lost out here with no one around was terrifying. I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on each step, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I stopped, the woods went too quiet, as if holding its breath. By the fourth night, I was nearly broken. I barely had any food left. My muscles screamed with each movement. I found myself shaking uncontrollably, not just from cold, but from fear and exhaustion. That night, I didn't even bother setting up the tent. I just lay on the ground with my pack under my head, staring into the dark. I don't know if I slept. If I did, it was short and restless. I woke at the faintest sound. My knife clutched so tight my hand ached. At some point, I heard heavy breathing not far off. It wasn't mine. It wasn't the wind. It was slow, deep, steady, moving past me. My body froze, every muscle locked. And then it was gone. The next day, I forced myself up and walked. I don't know how many hours passed. I just moved step after step, my body on autopilot. At last, in the distance, I saw something that almost made me cry. A trail marker, old, weathered, but real. I followed it, my pace quickening, my chest pounding with hope. Eventually, the trees thinned, and I saw the gravel lot where I had left my car. My legs nearly gave out, but I pushed forward until I reached it. My car was still there, covered in dust and pine needles. I opened the door with shaking hands, dropped my pack inside, and sat behind the wheel. For a long time, I just sat. I had always enjoyed hiking alone. Most people I knew preferred group hikes or short walks on easy trails, but I liked the quiet, the space, and the feeling of being surrounded by nothing but trees, rocks, dirt, and sky. For me, hiking was less about exercise and more about clearing my head. The longer and rougher the trail, the more I felt I could leave behind the noise of regular life. That's what pushed me to take a long weekend trip one late summer. I wanted something remote, something that would make me feel far away from traffic, houses, and phones. After looking at some maps, I decided on a section of trail in the northern mountains. It wasn't the most famous route, which meant fewer people. The descriptions I found said it was difficult in places, with steep climbs, loose ground, and narrow ledges. But it also promised open views, quiet valleys, and a stretch that followed a cold, fast river. That sounded perfect to me. I packed the basics: a tent, sleeping bag, small stove, food for 3 days, extra water bottles, a knife, a flashlight, a headlamp, a lighter, and a first aid kit. I packed light, but not too light. I wanted to be ready for anything. My plan was to hike in about 12 miles the first day, camp near the river, push further up into the ridge on the second day, then loop back down on the third day. The morning I started, the weather was cool and clear. The sun came through the trees in long strips of gold, and the dirt on the trail was still dark with dew. My backpack felt heavy for the first mile, but I got used to it. The forest was thick, and the air smelled like pine and damp soil. For a while, I could hear birds calling back and forth, but after a few hours, the woods grew quieter. By mid-afternoon, I had covered most of the distance I wanted for the day. The trail dropped steeply, winding down through rocks and roots, until I finally reached the river. It was faster than I expected, a white and gray rush over big stones, the sound filling the valley. I found a flat area under some trees where I could set up my tent. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the river was only about 30 yards away. I boiled water, ate some dried food, and watched the river until the light faded. That first night was uneventful. I slept with the sound of the water steady in the background. A couple of times I woke up to small noises, branches snapping somewhere in the distance, but I told myself it was just deer moving around. I fell back asleep each time without much thought. The next morning I woke early, packed my things, and started the climb up toward the ridge. This part of the trail was rougher. The ground tilted up sharply, and I had to push hard, using my hands at times to steady myself. The forest thinned as I climbed, and patches of bare rock showed through. After about 3 hours, I reached a stretch where the trail narrowed to a ledge no more than 3 feet wide, with a steep drop on one side. I slowed down, planting each step carefully. The wind had picked up, and it carried the smell of dry stone. When I finally reached the ridge itself, the view opened wide. I could see miles of forest rolling out below, the river flashing silver between the trees. The horizon seemed endless, and the only sign of human life was the faint line of the trail I had just come from. I sat there for a long time, drinking water, letting the wind cool my face. From that point, the trail continued along the ridge, dipping and rising. I followed it until late afternoon, then began looking for a place to camp. The ridge was too rocky and exposed, but about a mile further the trail sloped down into a small hollow with scattered trees. I set up camp there, ate a simple meal, and stretched out inside the tent as the sky turned dark. That second night was when things began to change. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a dream that woke me. I just opened my eyes with the clear sense that something was off. At first, I thought it was the wind, since it was rattling the tent fabric. But then I realized I couldn't hear the steady sound of insects anymore. Usually the woods buzz and click through the night, but now it was almost silent. I lay still, listening. My heart was already beating harder than it should have been. Then I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps on dry ground. Slow, deliberate. A few steps, then a pause. Another few steps. They sounded close, maybe just beyond the glow of the moonlight outside. I stayed completely still. I didn't move or breathe loudly. The steps came closer, stopped again, and for several seconds there was nothing. I thought about reaching for my knife, which I had left beside my sleeping bag, but I was afraid even that small motion might make a sound. After what felt like minutes, the steps moved away. I heard them fade, then nothing but the wind again. I stayed awake for hours, straining to hear anything else. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me down, and I fell into a light, restless sleep. In the morning, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it could have been an animal. The steps had sounded like a person's, but maybe it was a deer or a bear passing nearby. I packed up my things quickly and got back on the trail. Still, I couldn't get rid of the unease. I kept looking behind me, half expecting to see someone following. That day, the trail took me deeper into rough country. The ground was uneven, the rocks sharp, and my legs grew heavy. The sun was strong, but the wind on the ridge made it feel cool. I covered fewer miles than I planned, partly because I kept stopping to look behind me. Each time I saw only empty trail and endless trees. By late afternoon, I found a spot to camp near a cluster of boulders. I built a small fire, even though I hadn't planned on it. I told myself it was just for warmth, but deep down I wanted the light. I ate, kept the fire going, and tried to settle my nerves. That night, the sounds returned. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It started the same way, with the crunch of something moving nearby. Then I heard what sounded like fabric brushing against branches. At one point, there was a faint clink, like metal striking against rock. I sat upright inside my tent, holding my knife, my heart pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. The noises circled slowly, never coming directly toward the tent, but always close. I wanted to shout, to scare off whatever it was, but the fear locked me in place. I waited, gripping the knife so tightly my hand ached. After what felt like hours, the sounds drifted away again, leaving only silence. When dawn came, I made a decision. I wasn't going to continue further along the loop. I needed to get out. I packed quickly and started back the way I came. My plan was to push hard, cover as much ground as possible, and try to reach the river camp again by nightfall. The hike back was brutal. My legs were sore, my pack felt twice as heavy, and I barely stopped to rest. I kept imagining footsteps behind me, though I never actually saw anyone. Each time the trail bent, I glanced back, certain that something would appear around the corner. By late afternoon, I reached the river valley again. Relief washed over me when I heard the roar of the water. I set up camp in the same spot as before, but this time I built a larger fire. I fed it constantly, stacking wood high so the flames would last. That night was the worst. The sounds came again, louder this time. I heard clear footsteps moving closer, then stopping. A rock shifted, rolled down a slope. I gripped my knife and sat by the fire, forcing myself not to look away from the dark. At one point, I thought I saw a shape move between the trees, but the firelight and shadows played tricks, and I couldn't be sure. The noises didn't stop. They circled again and again, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, but never gone. My chest tightened, and I felt the sweat on my back even though the night was cold. I stayed awake the whole night, never once closing my eyes. When the sky finally lightened, I packed my things faster than I ever had. My only thought was to get out. I followed the trail down the valley, moving as quickly as I could, my legs shaking from exhaustion but my fear keeping me going. The last miles felt endless. Every sound in the forest made me flinch. Branches cracked, leaves shifted, birds flew up suddenly, and each time I felt sure something, or someone, was just behind me. At last, the trail opened near the road where I had parked my car. The sight of it almost made me collapse. I dropped my pack into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors with shaking hands. Only when I was several miles down the road did I finally feel like I could breathe again. The trees thinned, the sky opened, and I left the mountains behind. I never found out what followed me those nights. Maybe it was a person, maybe more than one. Maybe it was someone living out there watching the trail. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, fear turning normal forest sounds into something more. But I know what I heard. I know how the footsteps paused, how they circled, how they never came too close but never left either. Since that trip, I haven't hiked alone again. The memory of those nights stays with me. The silence of the insects gone, the crunch of dry ground